thought you guys would find interesting is where do anglers get their fishing information? So the top number, 77%, is from family and friends. 48% said fishing websites and blogs. Otherwise, 43% said newspapers, magazines, 25% government websites. Where you fish for any people, 13% said social media. So right now it's not that high. So maybe you can increase that. And 12% said fishing organizations.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
The newspaper magazine, is that, do you have any idea how much is ads and how much is editorial?
No, it just said newspapers. Okay, now I'll just, since this is the North Atlantic, I want to just focus on the Atlantic coast for now. Across the Atlantic from Maine to Florida, this is the number of trips people took in 2012. We define an angler trip as 1 day of fishing. So if they went for 2 days and they spent the night, that would be 2 angler trips. Okay. So you can see that by far Florida, swamps everything else in terms of number of trips. But North Carolina is important, Massachusetts is important, and you can see how it breaks out there. So total on the Atlantic side, in all 3 modes that we measure, shore, private boat, charter boat, or what we also call for hire, 53 million angler trips. So no small potatoes. Okay, now 2011, I conducted this national expenditure survey of saltwater anglers in all 26 coastal states. We include Florida twice. We do the Atlantic side of Florida, what we call East Florida, and then the Gulf, West Florida. We count that as 2 separate because they're different fisheries on the Gulf and the Atlantic side. And we asked people, what are you spending on this trip? So we intercepted people in the states where we have an angler intercept survey, which is pretty much the Atlantic and Gulf states, not including Texas, and not the West Coast or Alaska. And by far the top thing people are spending money on trips is auto fuel, okay, followed by boat fuel. And then you can see how it goes out from there. So total expenditures in the U.S. on saltwater angling, trip expenditures, that is $4.4 billion. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details, but the way we analyze this is we do it for all 3 modes. We do the shore. We have an average shore trip expenditure, average for hire trip expenditure, and average private boat trip expenditure per angler trip. And then we can use that to multiply by the number of trips. And we do it by state. So by state, by mode, and by residents and non-residents of that state. And then we can come up with total spending in that state. And I should mention, we do this survey every 5 years. So before 2011, it was in 2006, and it would be 2016 that we do the next one. Then, after we intercepted people in the field and asked them on that trip what they had spent money on, we asked them for their name and address, so we can mail them a survey, or they could fill it out over the internet. We send them an email to look at their durable goods. And the question there was, in the past 12 months, how much did you spend on various things that break out into these categories? So like on rods and reels, tackle, what we call other equipment, things like binoculars, camping equipment, fishing, clothing, sort of an assortment of stuff. Anything related to a boat that you use for marine recreational fishing, anything, if you have a vehicle that you pull your boat, like a trailer or a truck, and any second home expenditures. So the other thing we ask is for all those different things, they could be used for freshwater fishing as well, or for just other recreational pursuits. We ask them to estimate what percentage of time they used the boat, for instance, that year in marine recreational fishing. And then we multiply that by the total expenditure to get for sure boat expenditures swamped everything else. So this is purchase of new boats, maintenance of the boat, storage of the boat, repairs, stuff like that. All of that's going into boat expenditure. 19 billion total in the US. All right, now, like I said, we do our survey, we break it out by residents and non-residents, so we can look at their spending patterns differently. Here's a map of across the country resident angler expenditures by state. And it's a little hard to see those numbers, so I'll just tell you. For resident spending, the top state was Texas, followed by California, and then West Florida. And here's non-resident spending, or tourists, and the pattern is slightly different. So there, West Florida is number 1, followed by North Carolina, and followed by Alaska. As Bob was saying, Alaska has a lot of non-resident anglers that fly up for the summer, spend a lot of money, and then they go back. So you can see then the patterns are different. So it's interesting, if you want to compare residents versus non-residents, you could get more into this kind of data and see where there are differences in which states have higher spending rates. So total tourist spending is 1.5 billion and total resident is 3 billion. So residents still outspend the tourist, but in a state, like within a given state, it might go up or down.
Sabrina,
Yeah.
If you go back, because it seems to me that those.
Where do you want me to go back?
That's
Okay.
Those states with the highest number of fishermen are also high population states.
That's true. So yes, remember I take the average expenditure by resident or non-resident within a mode, and then I multiply by the number of trips and anglers in that state. This is total expenditure, by the way, not just trips.
Sorry, can I ask you a question about the second homes? Because you include all the expenditures on the second homes as part of angler spending.
Well, remember, we asked them to estimate what fraction of that expenditure and use was for marine recreational fishing. All right, so here's just tourist spending as a percentage of resident spending across the country. As I mentioned, Alaska has a huge amount of non-resident expenditures. Interestingly, Maine does too. And then you can see that Rhode Island and South Carolina and West Florida. Okay, so I was talking about highly migratory species anglers. Our thesis going into the research was that they spend a lot more than the average angler in the U.S. Now, I should mention that this is just in the Atlantic that we're talking about, not the Pacific. So from Maine to North Carolina, we looked at people who had bought a permit. You have to have a permit in the U.S. for highly migratory species. And it's a permit that goes with the boat. You shore HMS angler. So we pulled that database and we sent that same mail expenditure survey to a random sample of those people and asked them basically the same questions we were asking everyone else. So HMS species include tuna, swordfish, and billfish, which are your marlin and your sailfish and sharks. To make things easier, we didn't look at charter HMS fishing in this survey. It's purely private boat fishing. And then we looked at their trip expenditures analyzed by type of species that they targeted. We want to know, do they spend more than other anglers? So in order to compare, I put together the average private boat expenditure for non-HMS species from the regular survey. This is how it shakes out across the states that we're looking at. So you can see none of them are even over $80.
Stuff and interest.
Yes. Sure. Okay. So here's how it is if you look at tunas as a group, sharks as a group, and billfish as a group. You can see that for tuna it's already $540 per trip on average, and then we multiply by the number of trips that we have estimates within NOAA on how many HMS trips there are. And so you can get 14.9 million trip expenditures. Sharks, 566, but there's fewer of them, so only 3.8 million. And billfish, a huge amount of money is being spent on billfish, right? But fewer trips. So total expenditures 5.9. So our thesis is correct. These guys are spending a lot more money than the average angler. And why is that? Because they need bigger boats to go out much further. Some of their rods and reels cost thousands of dollars. I understand the gas alone for that boat, is pretty big. So that was the trip expenditures, and on durables, their average is $13,532 per year, which is a lot more than any of the other regular anglers are spending. There's 14,206 permits, and this is for 2011. So $192 million total being spent on durable goods by HMS anglers. And if you look at the economic impacts of that, we have a software called IMPLAN that was developed by the U.S. Forest Service originally, and they have it for every state. And you can plug it in either at the state level or at the national level. I did the national level. Well, I built the model for the states in question, North Carolina to Maine. And so that translated to 358 million in sales. What we call value added is the value added to GDP of that region. $196 million and supported 2,400 jobs. So no small potatoes there. Okay. So in summary, in 2011, U.S. saltwater anglers spent 4.4 billion on trips and 19 billion on durable goods. Both resident and tourist anglers are important to the economies of the coastal states, but within a state it may vary who's spending more. And having this good socioeconomic data can provide information on angler characteristics and preferences, fishing-related expenditures, and how those expenditures translate to that economy in the state. And you might ask, well, what do we do with all this information? In my office directly, we publish a thing every year called Fisheries Economics of the U.S. And so we have statistics on commercial fishing as well as recreational fishing. And so we use these survey numbers along with the number of participants and trips that year to estimate the economic impacts by states. So people can refer to that for whatever studies they might be doing. A lot of the different fisheries management councils will use this when they're trying to decide how to change regulations within a state to see, how that will impact their regional economy. So you can also use these numbers. If a state was going to build a fishing pier, for instance, they can see, is it worth doing it? Because this is how many jobs or things will be supported by fishing. There's a lot of uses for these numbers. And I get a lot of requests for these numbers. But people often misuse them, which is the other thing I want to say. This is not value as economists think of value. That's more what we call willingness to pay. This is economic impact or economic contribution, and the two things should not be confused. I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Any questions? Yes.
If you go back to, well, maybe you can just answer it. You had an estimate for HMS fishing for private boats. Do you have any sense of what that would be for commercial?
You mean the for hire?
Yeah.
No, not at this point.
Yes, I guess. Is it the same or bigger or smaller?
I would say smaller because there's fewer of them. Pretty much on a regular survey for a private boat is more than of the shore, the for hire. Private boat expenditures and economic impacts are the largest of the three modes. So just based on that alone, I'd say it's
Would be that how much does it cost to make these surveys per year?
well, like I said, we only do it every 5 years because it's a lot of work. I mean, you can imagine every state has its own issues to some extent, so you have to kind of figure out where you're going to get the sample frame from, which is a lot of information. All the different survey versions for each different state. I mean, they're the same questions, but we have to put like Maine or North Carolina or whatever on it. And coordinating with different people in different states to carry it out. The West Coast doesn't participate in the same intercept survey, so I had to get license frames in California, Oregon, and Washington. So given all that, it was about $1 million to carry out the 2011 survey. So.
But your sample frame is licensed sales.
No, for this, the main sample frame is the angler intercept survey conducted by NOAA Fisheries in partnerships with states. But for the West Coast states, it has to be licensed frames because we don't do an intercept survey. So it's a little different depending on which state it is.
The states do it.
Well, California does.
In Oregon.
Only a boat-based survey, not an angler survey. So we had to use Oregon and Washington licenses. And in California, we did do some of the intercept surveys, but it was a mail survey, mostly coming off their telephone survey of the license frame, so it was a little complicated, but yeah.
What about the response rates for these studies? Is it generally high? Is it high enough? Or how do you treat it in a...
Well, I did have a map I was going to show you, but I took that out on response rates across the states. It varied by state. In Alaska, it was high, it was 64%. But then we pre-called the anglers to say, could we send you the survey? Generally, for the intercept portion, was high, like 70-something%. For the male portion of that survey, it would drop down in the 30s%. But so it just varies a little bit. But I would say on average, I'd say 35% across the country.
No, I
To
think
the male part of the survey.
it's really important if you use this value to aggregate some, if you take a mean estimate and use that and aggregate it, then I think it's really important to treat well, you really have to be aware of low response rates and the impact on the estimate. Because generally you don't see that kind of statistics.
Right.
But I guess you
But for
treat it.
instance, in Florida, we had over 1,000 respondents, even though it was a low response rate.
Yeah,
So, you know,
that's
big numbers.
Yeah.
In summary, as you said, it's 1 million to do this, and when you divide it to 5 years, it's only $200,000 per year. And when we think it's a pretty, not so much money to do it outside Nordic countries.
Well, it would certainly be smaller because, I mean, we had a huge sample size, right? I mean, we had over, I can't remember exactly now, but, let's see if I can remember. The intercept alone was huge, you know, like over 14,000 people that we interviewed, so. And then the mail surveys run, typically the contractors charge us about $40 to $50 per return. So if you think of it on that sense, you're not surveying that many people, it certainly won't be as expensive as here. I mean, we had 26 different states we're doing, plus the HMS.
I guess though you're relying quite heavily on the MRIP.
That's right. We're piggybacking on the MRIP, so that reduces our cost a lot.
But the MRIP survey costs a significant amount of money. I don't know whether you know how much that is.
Yeah.
I think that's in the region of
A couple million.
I think it's maybe even a bit more than
Yeah,
that.
so I can give you an estimate. This year, we're gonna do the durable portion of the survey in all states except Hawaii. And we're gonna go off the license frames this time. And the contractor is charging us $650,000 for a much smaller sample because we're not piggybacking on the MRIP. So, for about 15,000 completes, it's gonna cost us about $650,000.
Okay, let's move on. Our young couple.
Okay, 10 years ago I asked NOAA about what it cost this recreational fishing, hunting and wildlife study you do every 5 years.
That's Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Study.
Yeah. And that was $10 million at the time. So they couldn't tell me what the recreational fishing part of it would be alone because it's a package.
Well, right, that's because they have the U.S. Census survey, Census Office do their survey for them, and they're very expensive because they actually have people go out to households, or it's a phone survey, and phone is always more expensive than mail, so their costs are much higher. But this year, Richard Aiken, who works on that survey, told me they're thinking of actually doing it maybe by mail, so he's trying to price it out right now for the next time.
Okay, just to make the point that this about pricing is a complicated thing, especially when you mix it up with hunting and others. But that could be a way forward in Europe that we teamed up with hunting and wildlife.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say what the cost would be here because you have different contractors and different methods possibly, but like I said, if you think for the mail survey alone, it's about 40 to 50 per complete survey.
And we have the language programs as well, on top of that.
Okay, we will go into details more also tomorrow.
Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about the survey methods. Feel free to ask me any questions. This was a huge effort and many, many people are involved. I mean, I kind of led it, but I can't do it alone. So it might not be as challenging in a smaller country though. So.